I now welcome Engineers Australia to come and give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Bernadette Foley, Acting Chief Engineer, Engineers Australia.
And Professor Lachlan Blackhall. I'm a Fellow of Engineers Australia and I'm also a Director on the Board of Engineers Australia.
Excellent, thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Before I invite you to make a brief opening statement and we proceed to discussions, would you please state if you're a current or former member of a political party or a union or an investor in the renewable or nuclear industries, please?
So before we make our opening statement, Engineers Australia is apolitical, engages across the political spectrum. Engineers Australia is a member of both the government and opposition's business dialogue networks. Engineers Australia is invested in a diversified portfolio comprised of cash, term deposits, property and a portfolio of equities and other financial securities that is managed by Morgan Stanley. Personally, I have no political affiliations. I do have a small share portfolio typical of a normal mum and dad type investment, including some energy-related shares.
On a personal level, no affiliation with a political party. I have a minority holding in a small technology company that's a spin out from the Australian National University where I work, and it does work in the distributed energy space.
Thank you. You came very prepared for this. Well done. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we head on to discussions.
Thank you for inviting Engineers Australia to today's public hearing. My name is Bernie Foley, as I said, and I'm the Acting Chief Engineer at Engineers Australia. I'm joined by Professor Lachlan Blackhall. Engineers Australia is a membership association for the engineering profession with over 130,000 individual members, and they're Australian-wide. Constituted by Royal Charter, our mission is to advance the science and practice of engineering for the benefit of the community. Engineers Australia plays a pivotal role in Australia by shaping and accrediting internationally recognised engineering degrees across the tertiary sector, by being the assessing authority for migration skills assessment for engineering occupations, credentialing engineers for chartered recognition and statutory registration eligibility, and importantly, throughout their engineering careers, we also provide support and facilitate ongoing professional development for those engineers to remain current and upskill or reskill to meet changing needs. And all of this is critical as we transition current and future workforce to support the energy transition. Our evidence today is informed by our members who have both broad and detailed expertise in nuclear energy and energy systems. As a profession, we take an evidence-based approach to problem solving, which ensures that our views are technology neutral and apolitical. Energy is not just a component of the economy, it's fundamental to our personal and social well-being. Our submission advocates for a future energy mix that ensures our energy system is safe, reliable, affordable and clean. Internationally, conventional nuclear power is a proven technology, and there is no technical reason why nuclear generation cannot be considered as part of Australia's future energy mix. However, the question being asked by this inquiry is whether nuclear energy is a viable part of Australia's future energy mix. This question requires not only technical considerations, but also considerations of cost, deployment timelines, social licence, waste and/or risk, and the development of a skilled workforce, to name a few. The consideration of deployment timeline is critical given Australia's Paris Agreement commitment to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030 and to net zero emissions by 2050. The consideration of nuclear energy must not unduly delay the decarbonisation of our economy. Engineers Australia's submission remains technology agnostic in that the technology which is best suited to the problem at hand, after full investigation, should be considered. In concluding, we want to leave you with 3 key points today. Our members and the broader engineering profession provide critical expertise that is necessary to help Australia navigate our energy transition. Engineers Australia plays a critical and central role in preparing the future engineering workforce. And it's worth noting here that the graduate engineers who will be graduating in the 2040s have not yet been born. More broadly, our members and the engineering profession are critical to solving complicated and complex problems, the types of problems that are arising during the energy transition. Thank you, and we welcome questions.
Thank you very much, and I will start with the Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much for appearing before us today. Can I just confirm, does Engineers Australia support the lifting of the moratorium against nuclear energy so it can stop being illegal in Australia?
Yeah, so ultimately we believe this is a question for state and federal governments to consider, but notwithstanding the legislative ban, we believe it's appropriate to consider the role that nuclear energy generation can play in Australia's future energy mix. And obviously, as we've already talked to, we consider that there's obviously important considerations that span technical, economic and social considerations, and the recommendations we've made in our submission really, we feel, provide a sensible approach to addressing these socio-techno-economic considerations.
So are you saying that the ban should be lifted or shouldn't?
We're saying that's a question for the governments of the day.
No, I understand that. But you'd like, okay, so let me put it differently. I take it you're probably not wanting to answer that clearly, which is okay, it's your right. But you're saying nuclear should be at least included in analysis on the best pathway to get to a net zero electricity grid. Is that right?
Yeah, we're saying that there's no technical or engineering reason that nuclear wouldn't be considered as part of the future energy mix. And obviously, the recommendations that we've suggested in the submission go to the many areas of consideration, which include technical, but also go to many other factors, including social, the timeline of deployment, and so on.
Okay. And then on the current government's plan for an 82% renewables grid by 2030, understanding they need between 6 to 7 gigawatts of new generation installed every single year. Last year, final investment decisions, so deal closed, were only 1.3 gigawatts. This year, I think it will be higher than that, but most experts who advise are probably saying to be about half of what's required. So they're way behind the 8 ball. Is it in Engineers Australia's view that 82% will be achieved despite the fact they're actually running well behind the schedule?
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately the engineering profession is here to solve the problems that we need to solve in order to navigate the energy transition. And so we are obviously currently working towards, as a country, the 43% reductions against 2005 carbon emissions by 2030, and that includes the 82% of renewable energy. And so
I suppose I'm asking, do you think it's achievable rather than a statement of the fact that the government has a target? I mean, the government also has the target. You mentioned 43% emissions reduction, but emissions haven't actually gone down since the government has come in.
Look,
so
ultimately, as a country, we need to achieve those targets in order to meet our Paris commitments.
Are we on track?
Well, I think if you look at the evidence, as you say, no, we're currently behind where we had hoped to be. But as a statement of ambition, we have to find a path in order to achieve those targets. And I think as a country, we need to come together, obviously, to achieve that. And in terms of the pathway to get to 2030, we have that laid out for us in the ISP that AEMO publish on a biannual basis.
Yes,
Final
thank
question,
you.
Deputy Chair.
Sure. Cost was one of the factors you think is important. The Frontier Economics has done an analysis now comparing Labor's pathway to a net zero grid to one which includes nuclear energy. The Department of Energy in the United States compared to renewables, only agreed to renewables plus nuclear, and found that once you have nuclear, it's 37% cheaper. Frontier Economics looked at step change and progressive scenarios. Step change versus step change with nuclear, 25% cheaper. Progressive versus progressive, 25% cheaper when nuclear is in the mix. Given the government believes in the step change scenario, which the coalition does not believe is achievable, with 98% all vehicle sales being EVs and the like. Step change, progressive, given there are two different pathways by two alternate future governments, ends up being a 44% difference in terms of the cost to get to net zero. Have you studied that report at all? Do you see any reason not to believe it's accurate?
Obviously, the report's only been recently released. We obviously have reviewed it in preparation for attending today. I think the report deserves to be scrutinised, and on behalf of the engineering profession, it will be scrutinised over the months ahead. Fundamentally, modelling is really important to make sure that we measure twice and cut once, because this is going to be a very expensive transition. When it comes to modelling, though, we need to be able to have apples to apples comparisons. And so while the Frontier Economics report is based on some of the approaches captured within the ISP, it's not modelled within the same framework as the ISP.
In what way?
Well, in the sense...
No more questions.
He's giving...
You had your chance.
No, hang on. Deputy Chair, we're talking about the same topic. You and your colleagues have done this multiple times today. So can we just hear Mr Blackwell out, please?
So fundamentally, Frontier Economics have the modelling framework that they have developed that informs the report that's in front of us. The ISP uses an AEMO developed framework. To do a true apples to apples comparison, we need to see the analysis done within the same framework. You'll notice as one of our recommendations that we've recommended in the next iteration of the ISP that it should include nuclear. And from an Engineers Australia perspective, that is the appropriate way to have an apples to apples comparison from a modelling perspective.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Ms Mascarenas.
Thank you for attending today. I'm going to ask some questions around building nuclear power stations on coal-fired sites, and in some ways it's almost questions around first principles, and I realise your submission didn't explicitly cover this. The thing that I'm wondering is what some of the challenges might be of building nuclear power generation on a coal site. And so, for example, if we consider the need for increased generation and storage around these coal sites, will it be necessary to upgrade transmission investment? And what other challenges do you think would be anticipated if we use coal-fired power station sites?
So look, I think at a very high level, the challenge we're going to face in addressing many of these questions about a rollout of nuclear is that we simply haven't done it here in Australia before. And so it's very hard to know the challenges that we might have to deal with because we'll be doing first of a kind in the Australian context. We obviously acknowledge that this has been done elsewhere in the international context. So I think specific site considerations, whether it's sort of waste management, whether it's access to water, whether it's transmission sizing, they really need to be fleshed out through more detailed analysis. It's very hard at a high level to simply say we need to do this here and this here. If we're going to be thinking about deploying billions of dollars in capital to build these new assets, we are going to have to go on a site-by-site basis. And as you say, obviously one of those considerations will be whether there do need to be upgrades to transmission.
The other question that I'm wondering about is planning for the engineering workforce, and what you're seeing is the demand, or what the demanding areas or the areas of growth are from a new engineer's perspective, in that line of recognising that the engineers that will be graduating in 2040 aren't even born yet. That's quite a powerful concept. And one of the things that I'd say that has been seen in WA for some of our mining companies when they've got a mining arm or a future energy arm, what the HR departments are saying is that everyone wants to work in the future energy department because they want to be a part of that decarbonisation pathway. So I'm wondering if you've either got some data or if there's anecdotal stuff that you can share with us and whether there's a demand for engineers saying that I'm interested working in the nuclear energy industry.
So the question of workforce is critical to us. It's part of our core business in relation to understanding the needs and the future needs. So we mentioned it in our submission as well, is we know that the needs are complex, but we're also recommending that a full analysis is actually undertaken both of existing and future. So we have data already in terms of the makeup of the Australian profession, where there are needs, where the supply is okay. What is critical though is that we know that in the coming decades we're going to need tens of thousands of additional engineers. And that's across the whole economy. So yes, within energy, but also in a number of different sectors. I think the other thing is, and it goes back to that question about those who are not yet born and the future workforce from that perspective. What we do need to do is we need to take a holistic approach, regardless of what energy mix we have, is that we actually have to start from the time that someone's 5 years old all the way through the system to ensure that we as Australia have an engineering profession, engineering workforce that can meet all of the challenges that we present. There's huge challenges, but there's also really exciting opportunities.
I think maybe just the other point to add here is that Engineers Australia also plays a critical role in doing migrant skills assessment, in ensuring that overseas born and overseas qualified engineers coming to Australia are actually recognised within our accreditation framework here, and that is critically important, obviously, because many overseas trained engineers actually come to Australia and then struggle to find employment here, and so we are losing out on their skills and experience and the diversity that they bring to the consideration of key engineering problems. So workforce is it's a really critical area, and as Bernie said, it is an area of work where we play a very central role. And we'd love to see more engagement around how we ensure that we have the workforce we need, yes, for energy transition, but also more broadly, given that this really is the golden age of engineering.
Anyone that's caught an Uber, there's so many skilled professionals out there, and if you haven't read the book Stellar Elephant by James Foley, I highly recommend it. I'll leave it there.
Ms. Mascarenhas. Mr. Chester.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you for being here today. Further on to Ms. Mascarenhas' questions, are Australian engineers trained to a world-class standard?
Yes, so our competency standards, so Engineers Australia is the custodian of professional standards. In Australia, we are members and we're the Australian signatory to the International Engineering Alliance. The International Engineering Alliance is responsible, it's a multilateral agreement, or it's a series of multilateral agreements which have benchmark standards for both graduate attributes, and so therefore the point at which engineering graduates complete their studies, and also professional competencies, so effectively that point within somebody's career where they've been assessed as competent to practice independently. Both of those are, yes, aligned to international benchmarks.
So we've heard other evidence that Australia, thankfully, probably due to a lot of your members, is actually very good, in fact excellent, at building safe structures. So would you agree that we build safe structures in Australia?
In the context of structural engineering, civil engineering, yeah, I mean, I think it's well known that Australia is a world leaders in civil engineering, and we've worked hard here to have good safety standards that are followed by the profession.
There's no trap in this. It's just I'm interested. No, the evidence we received was that Australia is very good at building safe structures, and the point was made that a lot of a nuclear power station structure is civil engineering. So that would be true.
Yep.
So there's no barrier in terms of our capacity as world-class trained engineers to build safe structures in that regard. Okay.
Yep.
So just the question around upskilling and reskilling to meet future needs, how quickly did your members have to adapt to the penetration of large-scale renewables to get to a point where they were competent? Quite quickly? Or?
They do it from an evolution perspective, and so as professional engineers there is continual professional development, and regardless of which role you're working within as a professional engineer, there is a commitment to continually develop your professionally.
Depending where you're specialising.
Yeah, and where you're specialising. And so therefore it's just bread and butter in terms of the engineering mindset, that you keep up with technology, you keep up with emerging trends, you do professional developments so that you can keep abreast of the evolving technologies.
And so, I mean, to give you some context for that, so, this year we're going to run about 850 continuing professional development opportunities, both for our members and for the broader profession. And then obviously as part of our ability to charter our members, we have a series of specialisations in which people can be chartered across particular areas. And that's another way through, at the sort of 7-year mark of an engineering career, that engineers are able to demonstrate, competency to practice.
So on that basis, with the prospect of the AUKUS agreement, the need for nuclear cable engineers on the horizon, would that, you expect to see a progression now of more engineers looking at that field, or is that how it happens? Or?
So there's two different parts to it. There are those that specialise from a nuclear engineering perspective, and then there's broader requirements of the engineering profession. So we know that it's not only nuclear engineers which are required. You said before, the civil engineers are critical in terms of a structural perspective. And so there is the component where you need to be nuclear aware. There's also the component for the technical expertise from a nuclear engineering perspective. So the area of specialisation that Lachlan referred to we refer to as an area of practice. We are currently developing an area of practice in nuclear engineering. At the moment, that is focused from an AUKUS perspective, but that is under development.
So you'd be confident, given we have world-class trained engineers, that we'd be smart enough as a nation to upskill to meet the needs of a changing environment. You'd be confident about that.
So we upskill regularly in terms of whatever the needs are there. Is that it's part and parcel of being an engineer.
Thank you. Sorry.
Can I maybe just to follow on from that? I think the challenge we do face as a nation, though, is that we have a finite engineering workforce at the moment, and we're talking a lot about upskilling and reskilling into multiple other areas. And actually, we're not going to have enough engineers if we're simply reskilling and upskilling the existing engineering cohort. And so this really does go back to this whole of life cycle approach to how we train our engineers. We need more engineering graduates coming out of universities. Universities have a critical role to play in actually ensuring that they are teaching the engineering competencies that we need for our future engineering workforce as well. So it's, yes, absolutely a reskilling and upskilling question, but it's also it's fundamentally a question of how we make sure we have enough engineers. And to Bernie's earlier point, all projections really point to the fact that we are going to be tens of thousands of engineers short over the coming decade and more. And so that really is something that government are going to need to look at holistically as well, how we get enough engineering graduates coming out of universities and out of into the corresponding trades. And then, yes, how we bring the existing engineering workforce up to skill to deal with new engineering requirements like AUKUS.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Dr. Molino.
Oh, thanks, Chair. So thanks very much for your evidence. And I was just interested in drilling a little into that upskilling issue. Because as you said, the economy and the engineering profession is having to upskill in new areas constantly. But as you say, there's an overarching set of shortages emerging. Is it fair to say that upskilling can take some time depending on the demands in various practice areas?
Absolutely, that's a fair statement. And that is that when you look at the needs, we're looking at the needs from now, we're looking at the needs for future. And so at the moment, the projects that are existing projects have engineers working on them, which range from fresh graduates all the way through to senior principal engineers. So it's not a matter of upskilling and reskilling everybody to the same level. It's about understanding the diversity of the workforce needs, and ensuring that the programs that you have in place take into account that there are different upskilling and different reskilling needs across the economy.
I think the other consideration too, which is particularly relevant for Engineers Australia at the moment, is that most complex problems that we're trying to solve require an engineering team And so, yes, that goes to engineers, professional engineers, technologists, associate engineers, but it also goes to the allied areas of competencies, which might sit outside the engineering disciplines, but which are necessary for the engineering team to be able to do their work. And so I think really, really important, obviously, when we think about the engineering workforce, we also think about all of those allied professions and how they contribute to the broader engineering teams that are solving these big, complex challenges for the nation.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting that when you're talking about engineering qualifications, both undergraduate and also some beyond undergraduate, we're talking about often 4-year plus degrees, very, very specialist technical qualifications.
Yes, absolutely. I think the other consideration, obviously, here as well is pathways between both the vet and the university sector as well. And perhaps, Bernie, you wanted to touch on that a bit more.
Yeah, I was going to mention that what we are seeing, and we know that there's a need there, is that there's different program structures. So typically you think and you conceptualise, because that is what's traditionally been there, a 4-year Bachelor of Engineering Honours from an Australian perspective, degree for a professional engineer. But as Lachlan mentioned as well, they're not the only types of engineers we need. We need 3-year qualified, we need 2-year qualified, we need trades, we need that learn while you earn approach as well, in terms of the work that we need now, and so therefore anything that we can do to support program structures which allow individuals to, yes, study, but also work in industry, the better. And there are some newer degree apprenticeship type models which allow flexibility with timelines for study. Does that answer the question?
Sorry.
Final question, Deputy. Final question, Dr. Molina.
Oh, thank you. Just a quick one. So obviously engineers are problem solvers, and the problems vary in their complexity and difficulty. There's risks of cost blowouts and time delays across any major project or infrastructure project. But is it fair to say that there are certain risk factors, like being at the cutting edge of technology or delivering something for the first time in a jurisdiction, that can tend to increase the risk of delay or cost blowout?
I think it's well understood that when you're doing first of a kind work, that there is a cost premium, and there's lots of commentary on that first of a kind premium sort of in the energy context that's captured in the gen cost and in other reports. I think more broadly, recognising that if we're talking about the energy transition, it is a incredibly complex problem to solve, and engineers are here to solve those complex problems. That's it's a key attribute of the profession. One of the key reasons, obviously, we like to see a really strong focus on engineers being part of the decision-making process to guide the energy transition here in Australia.
Thank you, Dr. Molina. Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah, that new technology cost premium you're talking about, Mr. Blackwell, would that apply to technologies like green hydrogen?
Yeah, I think the percentage uplift for first of a kind undoubtedly would change depending on the technology, but absolutely, if we're doing something for the first of a kind, there's always an innovation premium.
And floating offshore wind?
Undoubtedly.
Yeah, okay. And then on, I think you mentioned earlier, frontier economics needs to be scrutinised and will be scrutinised in the months ahead.
Yep.
The AEMA ISP has been out for a fair while longer than the Frontier Economics report. Do you feel like the assumptions that underpin that report are realistic and robust?
And these are ultimately very complex models, and we do, as a community, need to scrutinise what the assumptions that are there, and they are regularly scrutinised. That's true for both Gen Cost and for the ISP, and it will be for the Frontier Economics piece. And I think ultimately, through that scrutiny, we get models that we understand. Yes. And so to my earlier comment, the reason it's important that we model within the same framework is so that we actually have a strong understanding of that framework. So it's important that we have these robust modelling approaches, and they will underpin how we come to a view on the optimal energy mix that Australia needs to have in order to reach our decarbonisation objectives, both in interim targets and also by 2050.
And is your view they're realistic?
I think the assumptions that are there correspond to the policies of the day. And ultimately, those policies have been set by the governments over many years, and so they are the appropriate considerations that need to go into the modelling.
So as an engineer and as a fellow, the ISP is assuming that onshore wind increases by 500% in 2030 to our highest ever peak year, which was 1920, with zero price escalation. Given the shortage, I think you're saying we're facing of engineers, we could be tens of thousands short, I think you said. Do you think it's realistic we could be producing 500% more onshore wind than we've ever produced before in just 4 short years, given those constraints with no price escalation?
Ultimately, I would defer to people who have expertise specifically in offshore wind, which is not my area of expertise. But I mean, as you're aware, the ISP draws on cost assumptions coming out of gen cost, which itself gets robust feedback. And the fact that we actually have modelling frameworks that are heavily scrutinised actually goes to the fact that we should they become robust contributions to the evidence base that guides our transition.
Yep. And look, this is not a trick question, but you said, I think in your submission you talk about let's get the evidence out on the table, and let's have discussions. You had a speaker scheduled, Robert Parker, who was pulled from speaking. Why was that? This was a nuclear scientist and engineer who was going to be talking about that. Isn't that part of that process?
Yeah, so look,
Get those facts out on the table.
So, as you'd be aware, in June we did cancel a CPD event. As an organisation, we've acknowledged that mistakes were made in how the event was cancelled. We've reflected and learnt from those mistakes. On the 24th of July, Robert came along and presented at a continuing professional development event hosted by Engineers Australia in Newcastle, and as I flagged before, this was one of 850 events that we've hosted this year. I think of relevance to the hearing, it's important that we note that Engineers Australia recognises that conventional nuclear power is a proven technology internationally, and on that basis there's no technical reason why nuclear generation shouldn't be considered as part of our energy mix. The point that we're obviously here today to make is that there's broader considerations which we need to assess in order to understand if
just on that,
nuclear is nuclear is
that,
viable though in the Australian context.
Should be considered. Well, isn't the very fact that it's illegal in Australia, isn't that a impediment for people to consider it? Isn't that an impediment for people to get the expertise to have the kind of debate you're trying to talk about? Don't you think us being the only country I'm aware of where it's actually illegal, isn't that an impediment to considering it? And why wouldn't you support it as science-based technical people in lifting that moratorium? I get you're trying to be apolitical, but I'm actually asking you a scientific, civil question. If we remove that moratorium, wouldn't that help, actually, or why wouldn't it? Explain to me why it wouldn't if you say no to that.
Yeah, look, I think if we return to the comments I made earlier, removing the legislative ban is a question for governments. Governments have the power to remove that ban. What we're saying is that that ban being there should not stop consideration, which we've talked about through our evidence today and through the submission. But the legislative ban is governments have in their hands the ability to lift that ban if they consider it appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Burnell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for providing evidence today. There's been a lot of talk throughout this whole committee hearing process about the LNP's plan and the costs associated with the plan for rollout for nuclear energy. One of the things that I found difficult through this process is we hear that they're going to be liquid water-cooled pressurised reactors, then they're small modular reactors, then it changes to, today we've heard dry cooling reactors. And there is a level of concern given that the Leader of the Opposition's clearly stated that this upcoming election is a referendum on nuclear energy. And the part that I struggle with is, how can we get a fair and accurate costing to go to the Australian public of what this proposal really will cost in dollars, given it's fully subsidised by the Australian taxpayers? What are the differences between the different types of reactors? Are they more efficient? Are they less efficient? Are they more expensive to build? Are they less expensive to build? Does that impact the overall cost projections for a full build-out across the country for 7 locations with an undetermined number of reactors at each location? Like, from your perspective, when you're looking at breaking it down and analysing, like, are you doing it on the AP 1000, APR 1400? Like, what are the complications with the fact that there's essentially no meat on the bone for experts to actually go, okay, this stacks up or it doesn't?
I think there's lots of questions in there. So, fundamentally, the first question is around, what are the different technologies that are available? We've obviously talked about we've touched on the international experience. That's with conventional nuclear. Obviously, there's now a lot of discussion around small modular reactors. Conventional nuclear is proven internationally. Small modular reactors are still effectively in a research and development experimental phase. You can't go out today and buy one of those. So notwithstanding those differences, if you want clarity on pricing, we need good modelling. And I've talked before about the importance of good modelling frameworks. And we have GenCost and we have the ISP, and they are two key models that inform the transition here in Australia. And I think it's really important to note that both models, get robust critique when they are updated and released, and that's appropriate. And actually, it's a good sign when people are engaging with models and providing that robust critique, and it's even better when those models then take that critique into account in the future versions that they release. And we've seen that recently with the latest GenCost model. It has taken the critique from stakeholders, and it has provided more information about that. So, fundamentally, as a country, if we're going to rely on models to inform the transition, we need to actually have trust in those models, and if we have questions, to engage robustly, and we do see that in practice.
So then how do we get accurate? Because I'm still lost on the whole situation where we can't have a debate or a vote on a concept if we're saying this type of reactor here and then it all of a sudden changes over here. Does that mean that you've lost your sorry, Chair, does that mean you've lost your mandate if you're saying, well, we're going to deliver this type, but you haven't taken into consideration this or these types over here, which potentially cost more? Or
I think fundamentally the cost for both conventional nuclear and for SMRs are covered in GenCost, and obviously for any proposed future energy mix that Australia has, it needs to be costed on the basis of the technologies that are being deployed. And again, I go back to the ISP. Fundamentally, the ISP is that process by which we understand the costs and economics and technical considerations of a future energy mix.
Because the reason why I'm asking some of that is, you said in the submission you put forward socially acceptable and seeking genuine community consultation and engagement. So you're talking about social licence there.
Absolutely.
And I'm just uncertain how you gain social licence if you don't know as a public what types of reactors we're talking about. Like, the technologies do make a difference. We heard down in Mudgee yesterday that there's concerns about water. So if we're not talking a water reactor down there, then there has to be an alternative for that community to be actually able to give or have an informed debate about their future in that region. The same as in South Australia. We've been told a small modular reactor, but they don't exist. We can't get one off the shelf, as you just said. how can people in my state have an informed debate about the legitimacy of delivering nuclear power in South Australia when we're talking about a technology that is not readily available? Like, it's, I won't say what I'm going to say, but anyway, I'll leave you to answer.
I think that's why it's critical, and in our submission as well, we talk about market regulatory bodies having the appropriate expertise and that engineering expertise and that insight from an engineering perspective. If we go back to fundamental engineering design, it is around looking at what options exist to identify the best mix. We talked before about site-specific requirements as well. You can't do those final analysis until you've actually got more detail, and we don't have that detail, or as far as I'm aware anyhow, that engineering analysis hasn't actually been undertaken for the Australian context. And for me, that becomes critical from a fundamental engineering mindset, engineering design perspective, is that you start with a broad understanding of what you're trying to achieve, and you refine at every single step until you get the design which is appropriate, which meets all the requirements and meets the objectives for what you're actually looking for.
I think maybe just to touch on the first part of your question around social license, there's really critical considerations obviously for the energy transition broadly, and I think one of the key things that we need to do as a country is recognise that this is a socio-techno-economic problem. And so recognising that all three dimensions of those need consideration is critically important to make sure that we get to an outcome that's of benefit to the whole country.
Thank you, Mr. Bennell. Firstly, thank you for what you guys do as engineers. You guys are amazing people. I wouldn't have always said that when I was a tradie, because quite often I disagreed with what I had to do from the engineer, but that's okay. And just following on from that a little bit, here's the 5-page document from the Coalition, plus a front cover of their plan for nuclear, plus what has been done by Frontier Economics. Is that you guys are very detail-driven people? Is there enough detail in that 5-page plan, plus what Frontier Economics have done, for Australians to make an informed decision on whether they think nuclear is viable? We're about to go to an election at some stage before the end of May. Do you think that is enough information for them to make a decision?
I think ultimately, as we've sort of laid out in our submission, we think that you need detailed evidence in order to actually understand the path to the optimum energy mix in Australia. And in our submission, we've made some recommendations around the kinds of analysis that we think need to be undertaken to contribute to the evidence base that is already there.
So would you say we're lacking a little bit of evidence and detail right now?
I think, as I've said, we've provided some recommendations in our submission, and ultimately, we feel those recommendations will be, a helpful contribution to the evidence base.
Thank you. And just on the workforce issue, I've worked with you guys quite a lot over the time since becoming lucky enough to become a politician. By 2050, you're going to be around 90,000 engineers short in this industry. How are we going to get more people involved into becoming engineers, but also fitters, trades, and all that sort of stuff that is needed along this journey as well? How are we going to entice more people with nuclear, with this side of things, and with AUKUS as well?
Fundamentally, we would love to see commitments from governments to actually addressing the skills shortfall that we face, yes, as engineers, but also in the engineering team. Engineers and the engineering team play a critical role in solving problems that are of interest to the nation. And so from that perspective, having a concerted focus and a policy outcomes focus on ensuring that we have that skilled workforce is critically important, and obviously we're here to help and keen to help to bring that to fruition over the decades ahead.
The only thing which I'd add to that is that it does need a whole system approach, and so engineering is not necessarily well understood, and so anything that we can do to raise the profile of engineering, the opportunities which are there, the diversity of the engineering profession, again with the allied professions as well, in terms of the opportunities are endless, and it is all about the communities and the environment within which we live.
Thank you very much for your evidence today. We're out of time, sorry, Ted.
You won't allow me one more?
No, we're out of time, sorry.
Okay.
Thank you for your time today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please